many of you may know, the chair of the CLPR is Lisa Garcia-Bedoya, and she's at a conference in Chicago right now and has asked me to step in for her and introduce our guest speaker today. And it's really a pleasure for me to do so, not only because he was a postdoc student of mine, but he is an alum of the place that I'm an alum of, and also a good friend over all these years. But before I go to the introduction, I'd like to make an announcement, and that is there will be a graduate student workshop on Latino issues starting this Saturday, May 5th, from 8:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. and it'll be here at the Shorb house. So if you're interested, please attend, and there are actually flyers that give you more information, and I believe they're available right around the corner here. Okay, for my duties today, it is a great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Abel Valenzuela. He received his BA from UC Berkeley right here, so we're welcoming him back. Secondly, he received his MCP and his PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, particularly in urban planning. And he has been a professor, assistant, associate, and full professor at the University of California at Los Angeles in the fields of urban planning and Chicano studies. Professor Valenzuela has been the editor of a number of books, most probably prominent being Prismatic Metropolis, Inequality in Los Angeles, and also, secondly, Immigration and Crime, Race, Ethnicity, and Violence. But for the last few years on his own research, he's been deeply involved in the topic of day laborers, which he's going to talk to us about today. He's written numerous papers on day laborers that have been published in a number of prevalent and important journals. And his research has been working towards a book that will summarize his findings that will be published by the Russell Sage Foundation. Today, he's going to talk to us about much of this information that he has been gathering over the years. And the title of the talk today is Regulating Informality, Worker Centers, and Day Laborers. I present Professor Abel Valenzuela.
Let me first of course thank Professor Lisa Garcia-Bedoya, who's not here with us today. She gingerly wrote me an email about a month ago and basically asked me for permission to not be here. And of course I said sure, it had to do with grant work, and she was in Chicago traveling. I completely understand. I told her not to sweat it. I've known her for a long time, so it's an easy thing to not worry about. Let me also thank Rebecca Alexander, who's been very gracious in hosting my trip. Planning all the logistics. There are three really strong connections that I have to Cal. So before I do the talk, I have to talk about my three connections. My theme, which I already talked about, one of them. But prior to him being one of my mentors here, I was actually spending time at what was called the Chicano Latino Policy Project, the predecessor to this wonderful center here, and I worked with Martin, who was a director at the time. I was the research director. This was in 1991 until about 1993. We actually came up with that really nice CLRP logo, right?
Which nobody can figure out.
Right. Rachel Moran also was transitioning into the post. She's now at UCLA. Excuse me?
It's the Olin.
It's the Olin, right. It was a good home for me because I had just finished up my coursework at MIT, and I needed to leave Boston for all kinds of different reasons. I wanted to come back to California, and so my dean and other colleagues were very generous in providing me space to write that dissertation. In 93 to 94, I did get the president's and the chancellor's postdoctoral fellowship, and that's where I got to know really well Chicano. I'm thankful that you're here. And I also did some work with Alex Zaragoza, Yeah, so this was really, really early on in my career, and then I did the postdoc in sociology in the Department of City and Regional Planning with Michael Tietz and, of course, Senator Jankowski. And then finally, of course, I was an undergraduate student here, and I had a lot of fun. It was a wonderful experience for me. I transferred from a small college in Riverside in 1993, and I graduated in 1986 and went straight to Boston to do my doctoral work. So I majored in what was called the social science field major. I earned a BA here at Berkeley, and I have nothing but fond memories. The color typology here is done purposefully, blue and gold, just so that you all know.
Thank you.
So when I provided the title for my talk, I was preparing for the writing of a critical chapter in my book manuscript, and Martin is correct. The book manuscript will be heading off to New York at Russell Sage Foundation at the end of the summer. And this chapter is a theory chapter. I've been challenged, mostly self-inflicted, to think of my work on day labor in both a narrow and a broadened or expansive perspective, at least when it comes to the issue of informality. Indulge me while I read two paragraphs, and I will not be reading my talk, but these two first paragraphs are important because I think I'm trying to explain what I mean by looking at day labor in both a narrow and in a broadened or an expansive perspective. I've been thinking about this topic for at least a decade. I've collected lots of data, both quantitative and qualitative. And it's been a lot of fun now trying to harness and mine that data and really make sense of it and put it together in a book. And so these are some of my thoughts. So what do I mean by the narrow? So the narrow is within the context of informality. Informality is a term used to describe a host of activities, economic and otherwise, that is increasingly gray in definition and in reality. I'll not quibble with the most accepted definition other than to say that it's pretty simple and narrow. It's usually framed as a market activity, including licit, but often in reference to illicit services or productions. Activities that fall under this realm are unregulated by the state, but the state knows about them, and they know about them quite well. When we speak of regulation within the context of informality, it means some form of oversight for purposes of taxes, the reporting of abuses, and the collection of other data by the state. The broader or the more expansive context is the nature of informality in the United States and, of course, elsewhere globally. I'm interested in understanding its prevalence, its characteristics, its rationale, advantages and disadvantages, and of course its social spatial implications. After all, that's kind of my geography planning background. These, I think, are really, really important factors in thinking how my work might engage the policy process. I think the broader context takes day labor out of the narrow realm of the definition of informality, and I think it allows for a more robust and a more theoretically convincing framework that is also grounded in labor market reality, in local and community-based reactions and interventions, and for the most part in some minimal state and federal interventions, right? With some states, particularly in the South, trying to curb this activity via both the supply and the demand side. I also contextualize the role of civil society in day labor. I think civil society is a force increasingly important in our country as the safety net further erodes, as good and also bad employment opportunities diminish, and as immigrants, legal and otherwise, turn to alternative forms of integration, social provision, and intervention and advocacy. So, for my talk, what I'll briefly do is situate day labor in the United States, including how and a few other scholars think of this labor market exchange. I'll draw on my own work to summarize what we know of day labor, its demographics, its earnings, spatiality, and a few other key issues, including some of its informal characteristics that lead most to conclude that it is an informal activity. So here I'm really suggesting that it's much more complicated than that. I'll then talk about how different actors are regulating this industry. paying particular attention to the role of civil society in their use of worker centers. Worker centers is a type of regulation that differs markedly from what the state has done or would do, and certainly much different than what unions, organized labor, or typical organizing efforts would do. I'll close by sharing some of my thoughts on informality as a frame for understanding day labor and the more complicated and the nuanced connections that day labor occupies in our political economy, including both positive and negative implications. Hey Jim, it's good to see you. So, for those of you who don't know what a day laborer is, I have some pictures, but I think most of you know what I'm talking about. Just in case. It's also always good to have pictures in the talk. So, what is day labor? There are two types of day labor industries that exist, both, and you can easily categorize them as informal and formal. According to different definitional sources, you can think of on-call workers as day laborers. Substitute teachers, those that are called to work for a couple of days, technically are considered day labor. Those who have ever worked for temporary staffing services, that's also considered a form of day labor. Those are what I would consider the formal components of day labor. The informal are in part the men who look for work on street corners. Right? So that's just a very, very rough category definition of day labor. I study the men who look for work on street corners, what many argue are informal workers. I interview and spend time with them in open air spaces, such as street curbs, empty lots, storefronts, or worker centers. And it's fair to say that the qualitative component of my work has greatly been pushed and influenced by Sanchez-Jankowski here. I refused, however, to do an ethnography. I just didn't think I would be hired to day labor. Hands are too soft, and my dad was convinced that I just couldn't do the arduous work, and you know, I didn't really want to do it, so I didn't do it. So, searching for temporary work. Let's talk a little bit, some more pictures. It's on a timer. Talk a little bit about some of the historical and popular manifestation. So, looking for work in public spaces is a time-honored tradition in the United States and elsewhere in the world. Indeed, day labor has existed for centuries. We can actually date back to medieval times. In the United States, day laborers can be traced back to at least 1780. Since at least the mid-1800s, shape-up sites, that's the name that's given to day labor hiring sites in the East Coast, in New York in particular, and in other Northeast ports, provided a system of hiring dock workers for the day, for half a day, by seemingly arbitrary selection from a gathering of men. Under this casual labor system, longshoremen seeking work were forced to gather on the docks every morning to wait for the calling call, which was shape up. This exchange was vividly captured in the movie Cinderella Man, and clearly, in my opinion, the most famous U.S. jornalero is not a Mexican or a Central American, but rather, I think he identified for some time as an American Indian, right? Marlon Brando. And he won an Academy Award for his role as a dock worker in the movie On the Waterfront. There's this one scene that I vividly recall where all the workers are just hovering around the foreman, and they're fighting for the little tag that would basically allow them the ability to go and work for that 1 hour. Of course, the movie had little to do with the actual market itself. It was much more complicated than that, but it is part, I think, of Hollywood lore as well, and so there is an important cultural context to this. So how do scholars think of day labor? Most of us think about it as part of a broader, larger process having to do with issues of globalization, immigration, and economic restructuring. I tend to really focus on the economic restructuring in most of my talks as a labor market supply issue, demand issue as well. I especially pay a lot of attention to contingent or non-standard employment. There's a whole lot of literature, mostly sociological. Arnie Kelleberg, for example, talking about how the relationships between employers and employers have fundamentally shifted in our country, right? Lots of data. Part-time workers is one example. Self-employed workers, people who consult, for example, or people who work in temporary staffing agencies. There's big growth in that part, and I argue that day labor is at the lower end of that contingent or non-standard employment. There's, of course, the very classical, or I should say neoclassical take on this, mostly championed by economics, and it looks at it as a equilibrium issue, right? If workers disappear, the employers will disappear. Likewise, if demand dries up, the workers will disappear. Not necessarily true. All you need to do is look at the Great Recession that we've seen in the past 3 years. Day laborers are still out there. There still seems to be some demand, though it has lessened. And then historical, and I just gave you a little bit of a taste for some of the writing that I've been doing, trying to better understand this market in a historical context. Here I've used the work of Eric Monkinen, for example, who's looked at the wandering poor, hobos, people who would literally go from city to city, usually ending up at what was called the city's stem, the central place where you might find houses, SROs, other benevolent organizations who would provide some services to the workers. It turns out that employers would drive to the city's stem and pick up these workers, both men and women, and drive them to a work site, put them to work, and at the end of the day, they would be paid in cash and driven back to this city center, right? So there's lots of history, and so I think it's part of this story. And then finally, labor market informality, right? The issue that I'm currently struggling, right? If you look at most popular accounts of this market, newspaper accounts, magazine accounts, some of the research, including my own, there's an argument to be made that this is a cash-based argument, and thus it occupies a lot of the characteristics of informality. And so what I want to do is somewhat challenge that and try to give a little bit more clarity to the informal component. Let me begin by, what do we know about day labor? Well, space is really, really important. And early in my work, I began exploring the different types of spaces that day laborers occupy. Indeed, I think a growing segment of the market is increasingly regulated. Right? We're seeing more and more cities trying to regulate day labor. Worker centers, by definition, regulate this market at a very local level. I'll talk a little bit later about the worker center movement. I think there are some very clear benefits that worker centers provide. For example, many of the workers or all the workers are usually free from harassment when they search from day labor. Early in my work, I documented all kinds of nasty indignities that day laborers suffer, including being harassed, racial epithets, and for folks who work with day laborers, you know that, you see it all the time. They're also, of course, vilified in popular media. They became the poster child for the undocumented. What's wrong with our immigration system and the undocumented population, and they only represent about 120,000 workers in the country, a figure that I estimated with a national survey back in 2004. So it's an unfair target. At worker centers, they're free from harassment. They're also provided shelter and bathrooms, for example. Some of the more innovative worker centers provide tool exchange. Waste dispute programs as well have been documented. I visited South Africa, and they have one of the most sophisticated tool exchange programs. Basically, if you have a broken tool, you can take it to a worker center and they'll repair the tool, or you can give them a tool that's functioning, and you'll eventually they eventually had a warehouse full of tools, and the day laborers were able to borrow the tools, think of it as a library and check out, and thus they're able to increase the probability of securing work. think it's a really wonderful global model that we might want to consider here in the States. I've not seen it replicated here in the United States. Many of these worker centers provide English as a second language and other adult education programs. The process of developing rules and enforcing these rules are usually done by the workers themselves, right? So there's a level of democracy, democratization process that is self-induced and self-enforced by the workers themselves. And so it's very empowering, and it aids in increasing worker consciousness, worker rights, worker solidarity. Very, very, I think, important characteristics to have in an increasingly hostile workplace environment for folks without papers. Some sites require a standing fee, but that's hard to do. It's hard to enforce, right? I mean, these guys are making a whole lot of money, and then to charge them a fee, however small it might be, it just is, you get a revolt. It's hard enough to get workers to go to worker centers and then to charge them. So usually they have a voluntary process, right? They pass a cut and people can donate something. And of course, there's an orderly queuing process in place, right? So it completely takes away any agency that a worker might have in a non-worker setting. And if you've ever observed workers looking for work in this manner, being aggressive really is to their advantage, right? Guys will jump in the flatbed of the pickup truck, they'll open the door and jump in the front seat. It works, and that's why they do it. And it's I think, creative and smart, and it increases their probability for getting hired. That's in part removed when you look for work in a worker center. The next type of worker centers are those that are unregulated. So I did a really simple typology early in my work, and an unregulated market is basically one that a hiring site where you don't find any regulation, right? You might think of just busy intersection. You can go to Washington, D.C., for example, and there's a nonprofit called Casa Maryland, and not too far away, there is one of the most amazing day labor hiring sites that I've ever seen, in part because it's just so large, upwards of 250 to 300 men looking for work at any given time. And it occupies multiple corners. We spent about a week just surveying that site alone. It's huge, huge, huge. But that would be considered an unregulated site, in part because there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. And then finally, you have what I call connected sites. These are sites that are connected to some type of industry, right? You got guys looking for work at painting stores or at landscaping stores, or where you can rent moving trucks. Ostensibly, they're going to be movers, or at home improvement stores. Again, looking for work in the construction industry. We also know that day labor is national in scope, and that it's primarily urban, though that doesn't mean that forms or types of day laborers, cousins, if you want to call it that, might exist in a rural context in the agricultural industry, for example. There's lots of historical examples of families, right, pulling up to the side of the road and putting up a sign looking for work, and growers picking up and hiring workers, families, and putting them to work on a seasonal basis. I mean, that sounds to me like day labor. We also know that documents, they're not required looking for work, right? It's just not a requirement. Harassment, we know, is commonplace. Again, it's at unregulated sites. And the size of these sites in general range from 15 to about 150 workers. As I mentioned earlier, there's about 120,000 day laborers, the highest nationally, with the highest concentration being in the West. LA, I think, is the capital of day labor. New York has a pretty sizable number of day laborers. The Bay Area is also pretty sizable. I think it would probably rank third, though. Atlanta might make a run for it. When we surveyed Atlanta, there were about a dozen sites. When we actually got out there in 2004, it almost doubled, right? We haven't gone back since, or to do any of the official surveys. That's why I'm thinking that it might compete with the Bay Area as well. The demographics of day labor, well, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly undocumented, about 70%. You know, it does mean that there's 30% who aren't undocumented, right? That gives you pause. Impoverished, Latinos, young, mix of recently arrived and older immigrants eager for work. A host of interesting data points like the percent of married day laborers, about half of them. Bifurcated education levels, right? Suggesting that not all of them are at the bottom of the educational spectrum. I remember interviewing somebody who was trained in legal studies in Mexico, right? So that was at the college level. And that's just one person that comes to mind, or many other day laborers who we interviewed who had these characteristics. Earnings. They don't make a whole lot of money. About $10 an hour is the going rate. I suspect that rate has lowered, and I know it differs regionally. I'm not sure what the going rate is here at Berkeley. $10 an hour. I suspect it's gone down as a result of the recession, or it's gone up.
Maybe guys don't go out for less than 12.
There you go.
But that's Berkeley.
Right, right. The problem with thinking of the hourly wage as a marker for their earnings is that they don't get work on a regular basis, right? So, you know, even if they're making $20 an hour, they're unlikely to get more than a couple days of work in a given 7-day search week, right? So that of course, really masks what a decent wage might look like, right? I mean, $12 an hour, some of you might be thinking not too bad, especially if you're an undergraduate student, right? You're working for about $10 an hour serving food. So earnings, not good at all. Daily indignities, lots of that. High incidences of workplace injury, about 1 in 5 workers reported suffering an injury requiring medical attention in the past year. There's other forms of indignities, wage theft. 1 in 2 day laborers has been ripped off of their wages. And I include those who don't get paid at all after doing the work, or those who get paid less than what was negotiated, right? Or you're asked to spend a couple extra hours and you're paid for only 6 hours, for example. Lots of different examples of wage theft. Lots of other examples of being denied food, water, or breaks, being insulted, abandoned at work sites, violence as well. There's merchant abuse, police abuse as well. We also know that the market exists outside of the United States, and that's been a lot of fun learning day labor outside of the United States. I've traveled to Tokyo. Imagine my surprise when I went to a community, Sanya, which is not too far away from Ueno Park, and I get there at about 5 o'clock, and there's literally hundreds of guys on street corners looking for work the way you would see Mexicans or Central Americans looking for work here in the Bay Area or in Los Angeles. I also have a picture, I should have brought it here, of me sharing a picture of Mexican day laborers with South African day laborers, right? There's day laboring in South Africa. I spent time in Johannesburg and in Cape Town. It turns out that Johannesburg, which is very, very small in size relative to LA, has about twice the number of hiring sites in Johannesburg. And thus, you know, you could think that it's probably twice the size of LA. But these are pictures of day laborers in South Africa, and here's some pictures of day laborers in Japan. They actually have a union in Japan, and it turns out that there's a journal in Japan, an academic journal in Japan devoted exclusively to the homeless, or to homeless issues, and it turns out that in Japan, day labor is synonymous with homelessness, right? That is, about 90% of day laborers in Japan are homeless, and so it's developed this really interesting niche, if you will, in day labor. So here are pictures. So, characteristics of informality and why some of us try to articulate day labor as an informal activity. As we know, it's cash-based and it's untaxed. It's also unregulated by federal and state governments and the labor departments, but they know a lot about day labor. In fact, the GAO commissioned a study after Luis Gutierrez was complaining about the rise of temporary staffing agencies and how they were ripping off lots of workers. And so he ordered them, or not ordered them, but he asked GAO to also look at the informal part. They were were kind of clueless in the sense that they called me up and a few other of us, and I spent some time talking to them about day labor and showing them some of the different hiring sites. They're ubiquitous. That kind of challenges day labor. I mean, informality, right? When we think of informality, oftentimes we think of underground or inside as opposed to outside. There is an aura of illegality. I mean, I have people, when I give talks in the Midwest or elsewhere, you know, whisper to me about the day laborers that they hired, as if it's, you know, they're embarrassed because they might have broken the law or something. And I try to convince them that they haven't broken the law. High rates of abuse and hazards, another characteristic of informal work. In part because informality isn't covered by Cal OSHA or OSHA for that matter at a national level. And we also know that it's connected to key growth industries in the formal economy, which some people who study informality really argue is a really necessary component to understand the growth and the demise of informality. By the way, Saskia Sasson many years ago predicted that day labor, not day labor, but rather informality would increase in the United States in big cities. And this is in contrast to many others who argued that as cities developed their economic base, informal work would disappear or become much, much more minimal. That's not been the case, I don't think, in the United States, or for that matter, globally, if anything. I think it's in reaction to shifting priorities and strategies by capitalists. I think Marx had it right. Capitalists are shifty, they're smart, they adjust, they do things differently. And I think the growth of informality is in part to adjust to those shifts in capitalism. All right. So, regulating and other forms of interventions. I think at a national level, day laborers, this is what folks do to intervene in this market. By and large, most municipalities do nothing. I've not published this, but we estimated with our national survey that there's about 1,200 informal and formal sites nationally. And most of them are left alone. And just, you know, some people, in some municipalities, it's not a bother, right? Other people have other worries, and so they don't focus their attention on day labor. That's probably decreasing as the issue has become much more capturing the media attention, and as the recession has rendered more and more unemployed folks. And we're beginning to see, of course, the growth of legislation. In fact, before the Supreme Court, we're trying to figure out what role, or differences between the role of the states and the federal government with regards to what many of us think is a federal issue, federal policy, right? I suspect if the Supreme Court upholds a lot of SB 1070, we're going to see lots of copycat legislation. And so I said that day labor will probably further be driven to the ground. Some of these regulations at the state level do target specifically day laborers, right? So it's in that language. And again, we're talking about a relatively small population, right, of workers. Connected, of course, is outright banning of day labor. But as you go down here, is the development of creative programs, right? And what I argue is where civil society comes in, and that's the creation of worker centers and organizing in non-traditional ways, right? There are some sites, Austin is one that comes to mind, where rather than providing a safe space, they're organizing at different hiring sites, right? Think of them as hubs of workers who are organized, but that's a strategy that they borrowed, I think, from CHIDLA, the early work of the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of LA with regards to day labor was not to create worker centers necessarily, but to organize workers across different hiring sites. And they did that through lots of creative ways, including having soccer tournaments between different corners. More than anything, providing a level of consciousness and worker rights development among day laborers, and then they figured that the creation of worker centers might be another more fruitful model, and so that in part began to develop. Now, I want to be really, really clear that the development of worker centers, and I do think it's a movement. There's a really fine book written by Janice Fine on worker centers, and it looks at different types of worker centers across the country. Worker centers were developed primarily in response to union apathy to organizing, I think, immigrant workers or workers in really difficult markets to organize, or to organize non-standard or contingent workers, right, where you're unable to identify one employer, or you have a firm where you organize all of the workers, right? Though, you know, unions do have a history, right? They've organized trades, right? And so that is a slightly different model than what I just described that unions do. Nonetheless, worker centers were created because unions weren't being involved, and now we have these really interesting arrangements, right? So the National Day Labor Organizing Network, NDLON, has a signed contract relationship with the AFL-CIO. And what they're thinking of doing is to create or to transition some of these worker centers into locals, right, where day laborers might be trained in some of the trades, and eventually they would transition out of that market into a union job in the construction industry, right? Lots of different types of worker centers exist, including those for domestic workers, taxi cab drivers, and restaurant workers. I think probably the most important and successful worker center nationally is Rock United, the Restaurant Opportunity Center. There's an affiliate in Los Angeles, but they've had victories, and they're organizing to increase the tip minimum wage. Anybody know what the tip minimum wage is in the United States? Crazy, huh? $2.13 is the tip minimum wage. It hasn't been increased in about, I forget the year, maybe 30 years ago. But it's just super, super low. And they're trying to garner attention, right? So that's what a tipped worker will earn. It doesn't apply here in California because we have our own minimum wage, but in other cities, in other parts of the country it does. I think the worker center movement is at its infancy. It's national in scope, but clearly concentrated northern, southern California, the East Coast in New York, and spread across the country. But it's not been with us for a long, long time. This chart here shows the formation of day labor worker centers. Most of them, 36 of them, were developed as recently as the past decade, since 2000, right? So it's still a little bit, I think, early to say anything too conclusive in terms of their success. But they've made some really, really important inroads. And so I think it's important to briefly talk about them. I think day labor worker centers have 4 really important primary functions, and they differ based on the resources that a worker center has, and also based on the creativity of the leader of a worker center. It's hard work, right? You have a Spartan budget. You have a space that you've probably negotiated with the city. They probably don't want you to be there. You have workers who don't want to be there as well, for some of the reasons that I suggested earlier, right? Being aggressive, being your own person, and not having to wait in line or having to follow certain rules is to your disadvantage if you're trying to get work for the day. Nonetheless, I still think it's important that we have worker centers for all kinds of different reasons. And for at least these 4 reasons, right? So worker centers, I think they do deal with labor standards, right? So there's lots of exaggerating going on when you hire a day laborer, or when you see a group of 10 guys who haven't worked for a couple of weeks, and you ask them if they know how to do drywall. They're all going to say yes, or most of them will say yes. Some might be a little bit more ginger about it. Some of them might share with you or show you their tools. So what they do oftentimes is they'll assess more thoughtfully the skill set of the workers. And the reason they do that is because they don't want employers to get very angry, because they want employers to be coming back to hire the workers, right? And it makes sense, right? It really does make sense to harbor good relations with employers, right? Because if you get employers going to worker centers, they bought into the system of hiring day laborers at worker centers. And so you want to be able to give them a good deal, right? Not an exploitative deal, but a good deal, and that includes a worker with the appropriate skill set, so to speak. And also provide labor standards for the workers, right? Employers have to register, they have to go through the process of hiring day laborers, they have to go to the worker center itself, they usually have to register their company or their name. So that if there's any issue, you can at least go back to them and either file a wage grievance or some other type of grievance. So labor standards is really, really important. I think worker centers, that's the only game in town that's doing labor standards for day laborers. This connection with the AFL-CIO is good. You know, we've done some stuff looking at Cal-OSHA and how they might become more involved. Nothing's happening in that regard. There's just no resources. The state's not interested in this market. It's not going to happen, but it's happening with worker centers. Policy advocacy and enforcement. Well, day laborers are, you know, they were out a couple days ago marching along with a bunch of other folks celebrating May Day and, of course, articulating displeasure in immigration reform or lack thereof. They aid in passing local ordinances. The LA City Council passed a local ordinance that makes it much more difficult for Home Depot to open up a store in LA. If they do, they have to provide space for day laborers, and they have to dig into their resources to do that. It's in the law books, right? It took about 2 years to pass. I remember testifying a few times. And when the vote came through, it was unanimous, right? But all the worker centers were there, and all the day laborers were there, and they were a part of that process, right? So local policy, advocacy, and local enforcement of the workers themselves is another really important and critical thing that worker centers do. And it's part of the bigger context of civil society that's increasingly important that many people, I think, don't talk about and in trying to understand immigrant integration. Civic engagement, right? So if you have a worker center, and in LA there's almost one for every city council district, it means that cities are providing some resources. And when cities do that, they have an arcane process to distribute resources. They want benchmarks of progress. They want to see data from the worker centers. And they want worker centers to be better linked with some of the cities, at least those administrators that are progressive and who really do care about some of the workers. I imagine Berkeley might be like that, but I'll let my colleagues around the room enlighten me in that regard. In LA, there was a requirement that worker centers be better engaged with the city and the service provisions that they provide, in part because they knew that there were some day laborers who didn't have, or who had documents and thus would be eligible for some of these. There's other forms of civic engagements as well. I won't get into it. And then finally, what I already suggested, social service delivery is very important. So here's a picture of the Masiwali Worker Center in Phoenix, Arizona, created by a really interesting character, Salvador Reza. I say that with all due respect. He's a really smart guy, one of the best organizers. His claim to fame is organizing the loncheros, the taco trucks in Arizona, which is a model for how taco trucks might be organized in the country. He was one of the founders of the center. It's in Mesa, and not too far away from Phoenix. Spartan budget, but the commitment of the workers was pretty phenomenal. Here you have some interesting economic development going on, where noodles are being sold on Chile, and the drinks, the women get about 50% of the profits, the other 50% go to the worker center itself. Not a whole lot of money being made there, because a cup of noodles gets old really quick, even with good salsa. But there's lots of activities going on here, and here's an example of some other form of worker empowerment going on in a worker center, right? So a worker center can provide space, I think, for thinking creatively about downtime, right? There's lots of downtime with day laborers. If you haven't been hired by about noon, it's unlikely to get hired thereafter. So what do you do for the rest of the day? Well, there's some of these activities that are going on. But by and large, I think you mostly see folks doing that. hanging out, waiting for work, sitting down. Lots of worker centers these days don't have lots going on in this regard. Here's some training going on. I think lots of you have been to these worker centers. This one's in, I believe it's North Hollywood. So, some concluding points. To regulate or not, worker center model and regulation. So, I do think day labor is increasingly moving towards regulation, right? You have the very punitive, nasty action going on at the state level, not too much action going on at the federal level, which in part, I guess, might explain why it's going on at the more local level. So while it's moving towards regulation, it's not necessarily the type used to curtail or to control informality, such as working with the state, such as CalOSHA, or the collection of taxes. We all know we need collection of taxes, but you guys don't make a whole lot of money anyways. Definitional issues, such as rural labor statistics, right, where these guys just aren't even talked about in any form of definition. So part of the story, I think, is understanding the processes of regulation at the local level, which is mostly, I think, categorized as fissures, right? Community fissures, conflict, overreactions. If you want to better understand day labor at the local level, I think both in a policy in a policy context, I think you really need to understand day labor in a local context. So to be clear, these local processes are not about regulating this market, but rather, I think, trying to make it disappear, or at least making the workers disappear in this market. Some of the actors in this local regulation I've listed here. This, of course, the bottom part here is some of the more exciting things going on with day labor. Lots of examples of great things going on at many of these worker centers, right? And then, of course, you have some of these nastier components that are basically trying to make the workers disappear, or the worker centers disappear themselves. And lots of different examples, right? Minutemen and others protesting worker centers, and it becomes a big chaotic issue. And I remember being at Glendale, and there was about 20 workers just sitting down. There was about 10 patrol cars, and then, of course, you had your Minutemen with their bullhorns and their flags and their nasty signs, and then you had a set of counter-protesters, folks who were with indigenous rights communities. They had some equally, I think, interesting signs, shall I say, who's the immigrant, pilgrim, things of that sort, right? But all the workers, they were completely inside the worker centers, not wanting to do with anything outside of them trying to get work. But I remember that very vividly. Now, what are some of the negatives of thinking of regulation, right? And this is, I guess, my more policy wonkish context, right? So do worker centers provide any benefits related to wages or frequency of hire? No, there's just not a whole lot of evidence there. We've run the data, done models up and down, left and right, and that goes back to my comment. It's a local issue, right? So you have $12 as a going rate in Berkeley, right? And so if that's the going rate and you're looking for work at a corner, it probably doesn't make sense for you to look for that to look for work at that corner. It makes more sense to go to that hiring center because you can probably get better wages. So it's locally driven, and as a result, you don't see great differences between worker centers and your informal sites, at least when it comes to wages and the frequency of hire, and the data bears that out. Okay, so it's even, is what I call it. Wage theft and abuse, it's a positive to look for work at a worker center because the data shows that wage theft goes down significantly, as does abuse and other forms of indignities that they suffer, right? So it doesn't disappear, but it goes down significantly, and that's statistically speaking. Worker capacity and development, right? It's important. really, really want to hit the hammer on the head that worker capacity development is probably the biggest contribution that organizations such as NDLON and others have done with regards to day labor. Right? You do have a cadre of folks, organizers, leaders, who have been trained, and they go out and organize and train other day laborers, and that's been going on for at least a dozen years, so that's positive. Local and political empowerment, that is a positive. Strength in numbers and organizing, another benefit of worker centers. Local market control, Hugh, right? How did you stand in line? I think that is something that most workers will vociferously argue about not looking for work at a worker center. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that worker centers have, right? Convincing a newcomer to stand at a worker center when they could go to a corner somewhere else, and it's a big struggle. And early in my work, when I would speak with cities about the creation of worker centers, I was always very clear that, look, it's not going to make informal sites disappear. I think it would have been false advertising to tell the cities that that would be the case, right, as an incentive to give them to get them to invest. But it removes that worker power, right, to go to an informal site and look for work. And that is, I think, the essence of day labor. And so there is a conflict, an inherent conflict here between the creation of worker centers, regulation, and of course, agency of the worker themselves. In my, again, kind of, got to pick and choose, I think the benefits of a worker center outweigh what I just suggested because of the larger context that I think is really super important. It stifles it alone site, which is something that we value in this country, right? Individualism, and trying to make ends meet and care for your family and all of that, as opposed to a more community context, right? And then of course, employment opportunities. It's connected to the first one. I know I have a negative here, and I suggest that it's even up there. So I think we should just ignore this one and just think of this top one here. Looks like a typo to me. So that's the conclusion of my talk, and it's allowed me to further, I think, complicate the story of informality. I think it's much more nuanced and complicated. I don't believe that to contextualize day labor as just an informal process is the accurate approach. I think it involves many of the factors that I discussed in today's talk. So thank you. Some of the processes of creating a worker center, right? So what's the incentive to create a safe place for workers to look for work? And it usually involves lots of conflict, right? You have merchants who are complaining, you have residents who live nearby who are complaining, you have passersby who are complaining, you have local elected officials who are complaining. They just don't like the aesthetic value as well. And so early on, folks thought, well, okay, if you don't want these guys looking for work in this informal process, let's create a safe space, a geographically assigned place where you can come together and employers and workers can exchange labor for wages. The problem then became, how do you funnel resources in city, state coffers? And so that became somewhat of a problem. But some cities who were a little bit more forward-thinking decided to make this investment, and as a result, you did have the creation of worker centers early on. That's correct. Okay. Most of them are public, city-sponsored, though. There's a growing share of church-based ones. There's been a couple of private ones that have emerged, and some folks who have made some pretty good money consulting, not me. The creation of worker centers, there's this woman who worked came out of UCLA. You can actually find her online. I think it's called the Day Labor Center. And she consults and makes a lot of money to cities who want to create a worker center. Anyhow, so there isn't, I don't think, financial gain for cities, but they, of course, get lots of credit for dealing with the day labor problem and some concerted effort. though you have lots of pushback. You have pushback from your anti-immigrant folks, folks who follow government spending and who have issues with cities investing in these centers. But clearly, it's the one form, I think, of intervention that is the most creative, the most thoughtful, it brings different actors together in a table, right? You have workers, you have employers, you have city officials, you have local merchants and residents, and at the very least, it gets people talking about this issue and trying to come up with a solution. And so I think it's been the most fruitful, forward-thinking approach to understanding day labor, but I'd be dishonest if I didn't talk about it in, I think, both a negative and positive context. And this issue of wages and frequency of hire, woo, I got beat up really, really good by some of my good friends in the day labor organizing movement. And we ran the data every way, including thoughtful massaging, speaking with good statisticians. Can't we? There has to be a way to show that one's wages and frequency of hire increases, but no, it comes out even. I mean, that's what the data shows. And so, you got to be honest with that. And so, there are other, of course, externalities, benefits that we can talk about that I think help us advocate or think about worker centers in a different light. But I think the bigger issue is this conflict that I stated earlier about getting workers to participate in worker centers, and I imagine that's the case here in Berkeley and in San Francisco. I know it is because I've had lots of conversations with Kurt, Jim, and others. Yeah.
I have a question. Can you say something about the internal governance of a lot of the centers? Because, in particular, the participation of day laborers themselves in that governance. Because I would imagine there's a great deal of resistance by day laborers themselves to be part of that for all the reasons that you've mentioned, and because of the popular notion that work centers function primarily to generate jobs, and when that doesn't happen, they just resist that. And so I'd be curious about the effectiveness of the worker centers in terms of internal governance.
Yeah, it's hard. The first thing is that the rules are developed by the day laborers, but you usually have an administrator, right? Somebody who might have a college education or who's been organizing day laborers, and so you put up certain rules, and some of the guys don't like the rules, and so you end up doing a vote. You have a democratic process, and majority wins, and so those who have lost that vote get upset. But I think over time, that initial resistance, I think, wears out, right? And you get more people buying in. The problem, I think, with a big overemphasis on some of these processes of democracy is if you don't get work, if you don't get jobs, it's all out the window, right? You got people who are extremely frustrated. They're trying to feed themselves. They're trying to send food home, to a country of origin, to their children, and who cares about these rules at that stage, right? So you have to weigh in that very desperate, difficult labor context with organizational processes that some of us, find extremely frustrating. I mean, geez, how many of us, get, react in a negative way by reading the, UCLA or the Berkeley Call, right? The faculty guidelines. It's just ridiculous, right? But you kind of have to do that. But yeah, I don't want to compare because it's not the same comparison. But it's a similar process of just getting bogged down and not wanting to have to deal with these minutiae. When you've agreed to participate in a worker center and you're not getting work. So one way to offset that is more creative queuing processes where some places will guarantee at least one day of work, right? If you've been searching and you haven't gotten selected, right? There are different ways to make it less first come, first served, right? But it's imperfect. It's an imperfect science because, as you know, demand is difficult, right? Especially during this recessionary period, right? So, the Ford Foundation has invested perhaps the most of any foundation in the development of worker centers, and for about 2 years, the big focus was on workforce development. So if you know the literature on workforce development, what's really unique is that it looks at both the supply and the demand side, and of course that's the important part, right? So the idea here is that not only do you train and develop workers, the supply side, right, but you need to train and develop them in a way to meet the demand. But likewise, you need to also let the demand know that there's this group of workers, right? So that model was basically Ford invested lots of resources to do workforce development among day laborers. And so at many worker centers across the country, you'll see more sophisticated ways to increase demand, from advertising, trying to develop web-based connections between employers and workers, advertising, different campaigns, right, to develop the demand side. For the very simple reason that, look, if you don't have workers going to work centers, it's just going to lose. It's going to just lose for everybody. I think here and there.
Everywhere.
Thank you for the presentation. It's really interesting. I have a question about why day labor worker centers arise out of post-1990s. And if that's the case, why not before if they have such a long history?
But they don't have, I don't think they have a very long history, but you're right.
I mean day laborers, yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I'm talking about the centers, how the centers arise.
Why?
Relative to day labor, since day labor has been along for so long. Well, when the whole historical connection, I think it's fair to say that these are close cousins of day labor, right? So dock workers, right? The process of their search, very similar to how day laborers look for work, except, I mean, you can think of an employer coming in, okay, I need 3 guys, right? I mean, similar to dock workers and a foreman saying I need a gang of 6 guys. They were called actually gangs, that's why I said that. And so it's the most similar that I've been able to find in a historical context, specific to an industry, right? Stevedore work, dock work, relative to day labor in a contemporary context, which is mostly focused on construction work. Landscaping, moving as well, and painting. You can somewhat make that connection to construction work. I think that the answer to your question, well, why didn't we have worker centers back then, is because I think the number of workers historically were small, just like they are small now in terms of day laboring, right? I think they were even smaller. So I think there's lots of evidence, because of economic restructuring, because of the growth of the temporary staffing agency, because of the growth of non-standard contingent work, that there are many, many more day laborers now than there were 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? So processes of intervention to deal with those workers back then were much different than they are now, right? And we also had unions, right? Unions were great institutions during their phoenix, right? During their zenith, when they were rising, right? They really did huge and powerful impacts, right? I mean, we got the weekend, we got the 5-day work day, we got 8 hours a day. Those are just the basics of what unions have done. But then you begin to see the decline, the dismantling of unions, and you see the increase of these types of workers. And folks began organizing, and unions weren't interested in organizing day laborers and other forms of contingent workers, taxi cab drivers, domestic workers, and others. And so worker centers were created. And some of the earliest ones were, before 1990, but only 4. And then, between 1990 and 1994, we see some increase, right? I think that the story for the rise in worker centers, and these are only day labor worker centers, right? As I mentioned, there are domestic worker centers, or taxi cab worker centers, and so all told, we may have 250 worker centers. I think we're going to see a continued growth, and that's because unions are unable to do that. Though, the AFL-CIO was very smart to sign up NDLON, right, the National Day Labor Organizing Network, in part because they need to increase their union density. And what better area than the residential construction industry, right? Who's been organizing workers in the residential construction industry? It hasn't been the trades, it hasn't been the AFL-CIO, it's been day laborers, it's been the National Day Labor Organizing Network. And so they win the AFL-CIO by signing this agreement, by working with them, because they have organizers who are doing really good work. I mean, it's hard to organize day laborers. And so worker centers is just one conduit for doing that. And I think it makes sense in a contemporary context, given what I just articulated.
I was excited to see you put civil society up as one of the categories, and you got excited about it too, but I'm not sure I understand its role in this story.
Sure. I know I didn't expand enough on that. Well, I think the movement of creating worker centers, I think, is part of the broader immigrant rights movement, demanding space, taking over space through protests, through their mere presence in very large numbers. You know, going anywhere in the Bay Area, going anywhere in Los Angeles, of course, their presence is so ubiquitous. But more importantly, is their presence through many different organizations, right? You have hometown associations, which aren't even regulated by the state, right? They're right underneath the radar, but they number hundreds, and they're organizing, they're raising resources, they're offering scholarships to you know, young people going on to college. We have lots of young people organizing themselves for the DREAM Act. I think that's all part of civil society. It's their they're taking agency in places that the state refuses to meddle with or get involved in, right? We've had anti-immigrant fervor for years now. I can't remember when in my lifetime when we haven't been so anti-immigrant, right? I was a child of Prop 187. I remember that. I was stunned that the state voted and passed, you know, Prop 187, and that I think it was, you know, one of my friends, you know, mockingly told me, yeah, guess, you know, what the Latino vote for that was. I think it was 30%, right? 70% voted against it, 30% voted for Prop 187, right? I mean, it was gut-wrenching. So we've seen this curtailment of, I think, rights for immigrants and for workers. And at the same time, we've seen the growth of their involvement in the nonprofit sector, in protest and march. I mean, I am convinced that the reason why Sensenbrenner bill did not pass was because of those spring protests that numbered more than any other protest in the history of the United States, right? I mean, civil rights protests don't come anywhere near the, you know, several million folks that were protesting across the country, right? So civil society and how immigrants have embraced, if you want to call that, that role of working with themselves, working with others, working with advocacy organizations, working with students, working with organized labor, working with universities, I think has resulted in at least somewhat of a safety net. And again, I use that term very gingerly because there is no safety net for immigrants, but things would be a lot worse if it wasn't for, I think, many of these organizations that fall under this rubric of civil society. Sure.
Well, Bill, you were mentioning earlier that one of your chapters, maybe the last chapter, is a theoretically oriented chapter, and if so, I'm imagining that's what will tie up so much information and research. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh God, well,
just a little bit.
You know, it's not going to be the last chapter. It's going to be the first one, and it's and a lot of what you see here was taken from that chapter, where I dabble about how others think about day labor and where it fits, and I really struggled over the whole informality. I was convinced when I first started doing my work on day labor in 1999 that this was an informal labor market, right? It was cash-based, and informality would help me understand where it fit theoretically. But the more and more I did work on this, the more and more I became convinced that it's part of our economic restructuring, and it best fits, I think, under the non-standard contingent labor market. framework, and day laborers occupy the bottom of that. It's connected to immigration. It's connected. There's some parts of it that's informal, right? Obviously, but it's not the driving explanatory factor theoretically. I don't think. That's how I'm
Yeah, I wanted to see if you could jump back to the dock workers for
Sure.
a second, and because they weren't always formal, right? They went from informal, were able
That's
to
right. And
organize.
they became what, the Teamsters.
Right, but they
Oh, not the
created.
Teamsters, the longshoremen.
Longshoremen.
One of the most powerful and best paid workers in the country, unions.
Because they built hiring halls.
Right.
Right, because they were able to control
Absolutely.
the labor market. They were able to, and the same thing with the building trades. That's part of how they were able to.
Good jobs. Right.
So, what happened? What's different between them and these worker centers that aren't able to monopolize that labor, aren't able to convince
Sure.
people to come in,
Yeah.
and aren't able to actually
Sure.
increase wages?
I think part of the story historically is if you look at the leadership of a lot of worker centers and day laborers, a lot of it is Central American driven, and so one of the easy connections is that union and sindicato mean bad things, right? Because many of these workers are killed and disappeared and so forth. So there was, I think, a reluctance to have any connection with organized labor in some historical context. I think it's difficult to organize undocumented workers, right? That's a huge, huge barrier, though it's happening. And we're only now, if you will, learning the tools on how to do that. I think it's also fair to say that the creation of powerful unions takes time, right? It doesn't happen overnight, right? And it took many, many years. There was lots of resistance, lots of debates, lots of conflict over those creations. I mean, if you look at the development of even the longshoremen, I think it was over a 35-year period, right? So, to be fair, it takes time to create some of these processes. But that's what I push in terms of how to think of the future, right? Is to create worker power. And I think worker centers is one promising conduit for that, probably the most promising conduit within day labor. And all you need to do is look outside of day labor worker centers to, for examples, look up at Rock United. They do great work, and they're a worker center. Domestic Worker Center Alliance. I mean, they're passing legislation, a domestic bill of rights. Now, it might be difficult to enforce, and there may be very few resources attached to that legislation, but the fact that you're going to have something that's passed, right, and a woman who's been hired by an unscrupulous employer who is not abiding by the law, a worker can say, look, this is the law, you have to follow the law, right? Most people get that in our country, right? And so that's a powerful, powerful tool. They just started organizing with real resources that you get from the Ford Foundation about a decade ago, and they've had major inroads, right? Lots of creative things going on. I think we're just at that very infant stage of that. It's exciting. It's interesting to see it happen before one's very eyes. I know a lot about Rock because I actually served on the board and president of that board, and so I always tout that as an example of a worker central model that's building worker power and is part of a broader movement of organizing immigrant workers. And so I think after that would follow day laborers and domestic workers as well. I'm not sure if any of you are on their listserv, but they tied themselves to Hollywood with that movie that was up for an Academy Award, and so did day laborers with the movie. I forget what it was. Better Life. That's creative. I mean, that you wouldn't have thought of that 10 years ago, right? But the fact that Hollywood is now addressing or looking at some of these issues in their stereotypical Hollywood way, it's good, I think, for this broader movement that needs to impact both cultural and everyday folks. There's going to be a movie that's going to highlight the creation of Rock United, which came about through the Twin Towers falling down. Right? There was a restaurant Top of the World, I think it was called, all the workers. But out of that, they were all organized, right? And so the union asked a couple of workers who didn't show up to work that day to organize and build a different model. And that's where Rock United came out of. That process is going to be highlighted by Danny Glover in one of his books. Yeah.
One last question, I think.
Thanks, Abel. Your work is very significant and important. The question is less about worker centers, but more about the informal work industry, informal labor. So depending on how liberal we want to take the concept of informal, for example, there are distinctions. So if like sex work falls in, you got a gender difference or distinction. But and I don't know how much of it is in the literature, but over the years I've kind of just had a curiosity that when I look around, the folks waiting for work at the corners are largely Latino, as you found. And like street performers, it's kind of a black industry. And so I wonder why that is, because both need work. Both these young racialized men need work, but this seems to be a Latino industry, this seems to be a black industry. And I've always kind of wondered what might explain that. And I'm thinking of Edna Bonasic's split labor, right? Is there a split labor theory of informal work that could be explained? And when you throw out the stevedores and dock workers, and maybe that's another racial experience itself. So and they all need work, so why are they in these industries?
Yeah, and, partly California, I think, is in your frame, and I think it's fair to say that most day laborers are travel to Atlanta, however, and you'll find significant African Americans looking for work. You can go to Chicago, and you go to this one neighborhood, and it's mostly Polish, and you can go to this one site in particular where you'll find upwards of 150 Poles, immigrant Poles, looking for work, just like Mexicans or Central Americans who occupy space adjacent to the big Polish site. It's much smaller. They're maybe 20, 30 guys relative to the 150 Poles who are hired mostly to do roofing work, which in Chicago is super dangerous because you got very steep roofs. And it's a niche, it's a labor market niche for many Polish roofers, right? In Boston, you have a significant Brazilian day labor market. So what I'm suggesting is that I think regionally, there are other racialized men who are also very vulnerable and also have the immigration connection, right? So maybe the question is more an immigration distinction relative to a U.S.-born African-American connection, but that's not necessarily the case in the South, where you do see more African-American day laborers. What I actually wrote a paper, I need to send it off someplace, where I compared Latino day laborers with African-American day laborers in the South, because that's where you find a larger concentration. And it turns out that African Americans experience higher rates of abuse and lower wages. And higher wages than do Latino day laborers, right? So they're getting paid better, but they're experiencing higher rates of abuse. I think I need to tease it out a little bit better, but again, it's in part suggesting that you do see racialized others in this market, perhaps not as much in California. And the question was also what explains it, or how we might think about it theoretically via a split informal labor market. I think that might be a useful way to possibly think about it. I've not thought about that issue in a very detailed way, partly because the examples that I've given you, I think they're more anomalies than they are the status quo. I think it's still about 90% Latino, even nationally, right? You just have these small examples where you have others participating, but they by no means are the driver of the demographic profile of day labor in the United States, which is overwhelmingly Latino and male and undocumented. And we look for Asians in Queens, for example, because we were told that Asians were day laboring out there, but we couldn't find any, and we did that explicitly. I think it's in part a a snowball effect. It's become a niche for Latino immigrants. The way you might think that janitorial work was a niche for African American workers, that's changed. It's no longer the case in the United States, but historically it was important. The way you might think of landscaping work for Japanese workers, and they still are in that trade, but the largest numbers are Latino. So I think in part demographics might explain it. The sheer numbers of poor Latino immigrants without documents, and it channels them into that market more than African Americans who we know are equally poor, but they do have documentation status, and so I think the notion of them standing alongside an undocumented immigrant probably isn't something they want to do. I mean, that's a Latino job, right? Talk to African Americans, and I've got some colleagues who have done that. Some of their surveys. Why don't you day labor? That's a Latino job. I'm not going to do that. That's what illegal immigrants do.
Well, we've de-labored him enough, I think, today. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you very much for this, and I believe there's some.